Norman Ravvin, welcome to Canadian Literature.
Thanks.
And we are here for the launch of the brand new issue, special issue on Mordecai Richler that you co-edited with Natalie Cook.
And we were lucky that I was able to be in town and, be here at the moment that you guys just finished with printing it up. I got to meet a lot of the people that I worked with here that I haven't met
At the
before.
launch party yesterday, yeah. That was great. And maybe you could tell us a little bit about all of the different roles that you play, aside from co-editing this issue.
Well, some of it comes from my undergraduate work here and my sort of divided interest between creative writing and scholarly research. So I was here as an undergrad where I sort of began to think of myself as a fiction writer, which I still am. And then also found really terrific professors at UBC who had an impact on me, and gradually with time I decided that I would follow that line too. So I ended up getting a PhD at U of T in North American Jewish literature, and then after that taught at Toronto, but then also at UNB in creative writing. And then now I'm at Concordia, where I teach Canadian Jewish studies. So my career has really divided in those two directions, between novel writing, short story writing, and all the kinds of things that scholarly researchers, scholarly teachers do.
So you're a published novelist as well as a...
My third novel just came out from Gaspro Press. It's called The Joyful Child. And they come far between because somehow the other side of my work doesn't allow for constant literary output, but this one is about a father and a young son, and it's set all around the country. And
does your academic work intersect with your creative work?
I would say typically not, except that all the reading, or much of the reading that you do as a teacher of contemporary writing somehow feeds, whether you think it can make a good model or a poor model, or it just makes you think about writing. So that pursuit serves the writing work too.
Right. And at Concordia, you're the chair of the Institute for Canadian Jewish Studies, is that right?
Right, which is a kind of a unique setup. They got a big philanthropic gift in the 90s from a family, which largely allowed them to set up an institute, hire a chair, so I'm that thing, the chair, and then proceed to try to firm up a discipline that is in many ways kind of ill-defined and modest in its way. Jewish studies overall is modest in Canada, so Canadian Jewish studies is that much more modest. But we were well enough resourced from that original gift that we were able to really take on a whole range of things, publishing program, quite major conferences, visiting scholars, scholarships, promoting students to travel and do the kinds of research that maybe young people hadn't been doing in the field, and then any number of other things, so that we had a pretty major presence in the city, in Montreal, from the time that I was hired, which was 99, till not too recently. I would say that we're entering a bit of maybe a budgetary period of budgetary challenge.
As you do.
But otherwise, we've been pretty active. Yeah.
And now you mentioned Canadian Jewish Studies as a modest field.
Right.
If you were explaining it to somebody who didn't know anything about it, what would you say?
Well, I guess I'm one of the only guys that goes around saying that. The other people in the field tend to not want to say that, and maybe they're wiser than I. But the thing kind of didn't exist in any kind of institutional way till fairly recently, when you start to see a few of these kinds of chairs set up. Now, these were always set up through outside funding typically. These were not programs that universities felt that they were motivated and inclined to create. So that's already kind of a vulnerable position for a discipline to be in. Mm-hmm. And many of the people that work in the field who are, say, a generation older than myself, or even 2 generations older, are typically from other fields. So they studied and researched as historians or sociologists, mm-hmm. and they were typically always on the left, so they took a look at labor history or the sociology of immigration. These were things obviously that had a nice link with what could become an interest in Jewish Canadian life. So some of their careers found their way to Canadian Jewish studies, as you might call it, by the time they were already nearly ready to retire or already very established. So the key figures like Hesh Troper, who's a historian in Toronto, Richard Menkes, who is just got his office just over here in Buchanan, come to it sort of sometimes by indirection. Richard Menkes here at UBC came to it a little more naturally in his own research. And in that way they come to it for personal reasons. So you have people kind of making a discipline in very idiosyncratic ways, and that doesn't allow for the creation of a whole lot of material. That doesn't necessarily mean that the university will understand it as a kind of a program presence, which typically it's not. In a place like Concordia, we have courses, but we're not able to. It's not a program. You don't come to do a minor, say, in Canadian Jewish Studies. You can add up a lot of courses, but it's kind of a hit and miss kind of process. So my generation, maybe there's a few of us who are the first who actually in some way kind of were trained to do it, even though my training was much more directly on North American Jewish writing. So there you could say I fall into it through the Canadian Jewish literary side. And then my challenge once I got to Concordia was to figure out, well, what could we do that would firm the discipline up? And I really took that as a serious challenge. Otherwise, it didn't seem to me there was any point in being a chair in this field. So the publishing program was key, making an anthology, bringing back books that had gone out of print that were kind of classics, that were sort of necessary, I thought. Sometimes doing small-scale things like chapbooks that just let the material quickly and easily get out there. Mm-hmm. And then two, taking advice from other non-literary people as to in what way the field could push out, whether it's through a conference or by inviting people from abroad. So you, in my case, you sort of see yourself as a kind of entrepreneur. You're kind of building a structure that wasn't there. As
an entrepreneur or somebody who's advocating for this existence of this field, did you ever find yourself having to justify the relevance or the existence of this subsection of a field that's kind of created from?
Well, I mean, sadly, if there's any kind of budget crunch at a university, which we, in the last decade, we have had a couple periods of decline and then seeming revival. I mean, they do go, the deans go looking for things to cut, and if you're a kind of a not understood or in any way vulnerable kind of presence, you will look kind of cuttable. Mm-hmm. So, yeah. So there was a period of a year or two when much of our energy was spent trying to confirm that we'd done this, we'd create the binder, we'd done all 150,000 things, and here's the outcome, and this is the remarkable gain for the university and the community. But the bottom line is, if you're not built very well into the infrastructure of the university, you can disappear.
Of course. And aside from the community initiatives and the publishing, in terms of the pure sort of academic interest, what would you say, why is it so important that we study Canadian Jewish Studies?
So that's a good question. Well, Canadian, I get the feeling, though I'm not a Canadian Studies specialist really, but I get the feeling that Canadian Studies is even somewhat vulnerable still. And that at major universities there will often be centers for the study of Canada and specialists who gather together to pursue that focus. And yet, alongside of what goes on there, something like ethnic studies or the role of an ethnic community in that larger picture is even further a challenge to get it noticed and to get it taught. And I'm pretty convinced, I've found it throughout the time that I've been doing it at Concordia, that students are very interested, not just Jewish students, and that their understanding of Canada, whether you're Jewish or non-Jewish, seems to be very focused on questions of ethnicity and some of the things you were thinking about when we talked yesterday, questions around race. And these are things that are very contemporary to them. And it's sort of at the heart of what we're thinking about as Canada changes in these years.
And do you find that it maybe intersects with Jewish American studies in some ways?
It could, and this is where it's so specific to the guy that's running the show. I love American literature, and I'm actually sort of in some ways more dedicated to cultural life of cities like New York than I am to Canadian cities. In the Jewish context, New York is really the most fascinating place. Montreal also is fascinating, but it hasn't been necessary. In some ways, I thought right from the start that we're already in the shadow of the American picture. So if that was going to be the strategy, to be saying, let's think about how much has been done in the American context, how interesting it is, and how we can sort of hitch our train to that. That seemed a bit risky and counterproductive. So I kind of have made it's just another world, and we know about it and we can pursue it in its own way, but we kind of don't need it to make our own thing take shape.
Now, the other thing I was wondering is that with maybe ethnic or quote-unquote minority studies fields, such as maybe Asian Canadian studies, there's sometimes some tension about moving from this kind of margin or minority position into the center of the academy and establishing yourself.
Meaning you might not want to do that?
Yeah, kind of like, you come from this position outside looking in, and you have some sort of, you can criticize it in some ways, but then once you're in, you kind of have to assimilate in different ways. And I was wondering if there's some tension for you.
Well, I'm going to have to think about that one. I mean, I guess because I come to it from the, once I get hired as a faculty member, I'm in. And I have no more stakes anymore, or not many stakes anymore, in trying to take that kind of oppositional or sort of, critical stance. I can take it through the approach I take in my writing, let's say, or the way that I approach a conference, and by the choices I make as to the kinds of specialists that I want to bring, so that you can try to open the dialogue as wide as you can. You can set things aside because you think, oh, well, that's so well handled by the majority community. So, this subject A and B, wow, they talk about that all the time. Maybe we as academics, we can look at things that are a little bit more sidelined. So one of my personal focuses has been Yiddish, and I've kind of gone against the grain, I guess, on that front, but it didn't cause any friction. It was maybe looked at with a bit of curiosity, but right from the start, as much as I could, initiate things that were associated with Yiddish writing and Yiddish historiography in Canada, which leads nicely to sort of immigrant history, just became a kind of a steady focus. And once it's there, and once it's being pursued, and once interesting things are being done, nobody minds. So you sort of find your way to bring these kind of maybe counter-institutional or counter-narratives into the discipline.
So working on it from within rather than...
Yeah.
I guess it's one way of...
Yeah, Yiddish, for me, that's the first thing that comes to mind, that really wouldn't have been a natural focus, wouldn't have needed to appear at all, but has played a fairly substantial role in what I've done.